my thought process on this type of concert, which is completely different than what most concerts are programmed like. There's a template if you go to any orchestra. And the template is oftentimes an overture, some large concerto of some sort, and then a symphony on the second half. That's the standard template to build a program. And you can switch things around and do different stuff and add in some suites, but that's overall what a template of creating a program is. And when the Timpanogos Symphony does their aspiring musician competition, we go completely against the template, and we're taking only concertos and only one movement of that concerto in addition to that. And so what you get is kind of like a collage concert in a way, because the pieces don't necessarily always intersect with a theme based on who the winners are. It might be some 20th century pieces, a Baroque concerto, and so to find a common thread in that is a little bit difficult. And so like the other programs on the seasons and then the next season that we have, a lot of it, there's always a theme, some sort of theme, and the space theme or romantics or the Russian composers like we had last month, anything like that. And so how do we find a common thread with an all concerto program, especially if it's just one movement of various concertos? And so that's what we're going to look into a little bit. And so the thread that we can get is really, we can see the evolution of the concerto, and you're going to hear the evolution of the concerto. I have arranged the 6 pieces. We have 6 winners, 6 young artists who are going to perform, and from the ages of 8 to 16, and they're playing some of the top repertoire for each of these composers that we're going to look at. There's 6 of them. All of them are completely different, from completely different lifestyles, from completely different periods, and we'll draw a couple threads that I found, but for the most part, the best thing is to listen to the evolution of what the word concerto means. Think of it as tomato, tomato. Concerto, concierto, or something like that. The concerto evolves, and for each composer, it's used differently. It's used quite a bit differently. So here's our lineup, and this is what the concert is going to be compromised of. And I haven't put it in concert order. This is chronological order. And so the oldest piece that you'll hear on the program is Haydn's Piano Concerto in D major, which is probably of his 11 piano concertos to what scholars are considering to be up to 25 piano concertos. There's disagreement on how many he actually wrote. This is probably one of the most famous, one of the most played. And then we have a pretty unique piece to the program. It's a guitar concerto by Giuliani, which is right next, just a few years after Haydn's piano concerto. Then we have Lalo's Symphony Espagnole for the violin, McDowell's piano concerto number 2, and we're into the romantics now. Rachmaninoff, everyone knows a little bit about Rachmaninoff or has heard some of his pieces. His most famous piano concerto, his 2nd piano concerto, and then Bartk's 2nd violin concerto. And so this is a chronological order, and through each one is technically a concerto. The only one that doesn't use that word is Lalo's Symphony Espagnole, which he wrote to be a symphony, not a concerto. It was a symphony, but it featured the violin so prominently that it is now seen mostly as a concerto piece that we get. So this is the lineup that we have. And let me tell you a little bit about the way that this program came to be. Every 2 years, the symphony does the Aspiring Musicians Competition, which is basically musicians from all across the state can enter into this competition, and they come and well, this year they submitted videos, and we had judges who took a look at the videos, rated them, and then we balanced out the ratings. And the top 20 who scored went to do the live audition for it. And from those top 20, we gathered the 6 who won. So it was a pretty intense process that we went about. And the kids, all of them, it was really difficult. The most difficult thing was that almost 50 of the applicants were phenomenal. And so, and then getting it to the 20 when they came into the live audition, it was even more mind-boggling because seeing it live is just that much more powerful. And then bringing it down to 6 was really, really difficult. So that's a testament to the youth and to the artistry of the young artists in the state of Utah and their teachers and everything like that. So who you're going to see are going to definitely have futures, all 6 of these bright upcoming stars. So let's start from the very beginning, which is with the piano concerto with Haydn, Haydn's piano concerto. Here's a little bit about Haydn. He was born in 1732 and he died in 1809. He had a pretty respectively long life for a classical artist and for someone living at this time. The piano concerto was written between 1780 and 1783, and what we're going to hear is the first movement, which is a vivace. Now, vivace is a very fast movement. He was an Austrian composer who was during the classical period, coming out of Mozart and really transitioning us into the works of Beethoven. And he is known as the father of the symphony because he wrote upwards of 104 works that were called symphonies. And this is more than anybody at this time, and this is almost more than anybody that we have currently. And so he's still kind of the reigning father of the symphony and giving us the template in different forms, sonata form, ABA form, and everything like that. He specialized later on in his career in something called Sturm und Drang, which is what we know and associate mostly with Beethoven and Beethoven's 6th Symphony. But Haydn used this, and this was a style of composition that is called storm and stress. And so having very, very, very intense motives and feelings, large chords, the whole orchestra, the strings are really sawing away on their instruments, and that's when we get the style of Sturm und Drang. And he uses this. And then in addition to that intensity, Haydn is known to be probably one of the most humorous composers that we've seen. Everything, there's jokes in a symphony. He has quartets in his string quartets. One of them is the joke. It's known as the joke. And it's just, you hear the laughter within the melodies. You hear the jokes happening, and they're practical jokes. And he was a prankster, basically. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of his more political pranks in a little bit. He composed over 1,000 pieces, so he's very prolific as a composer. And what you'll see as a common thread is that he was a conductor as well. And so he is really prominently associated with this place. This is the Esterhazy Palace in Austria. And what it was is this demonstrated the patronage system. So Haydn was growing up at a time and coming into prominence and getting a career at a time when composing wasn't really sought after as a legitimate career path. People wanted you to be a doctor or a lawyer even at this time, or a scholar or a professor or something like that. Those were the high-ranking careers, not a musician and certainly not a composer. But during the patronage system, we had kings and queens and royalty who were employing these musicians, especially composers. And so we got court composers. And so he was on the estate of Esterhazy for Prince Esterhazy, and he would compose these pieces. Mostly his symphonies that he would be premiering. Every week he would have a brand new piece. Another person who was very involved in the patronage system was Bach, who was employed by the courts and some of the churches at the time. And so Bach's prolific writing was due to the patronage system is now. Now, we don't have the patronage system as much anymore. What we've shifted over to is composers working on commission. And so that you can kind of think as the future of the patronage system. It turned into commissioned works for composers. But the patronage system allowed these composers to write so much, 1,000 works, over 1,000 works in Haydn's repertoire. And so one of the most famous stories that I just love. And the symphony performed this a couple of years back. It's his 45th symphony, and it's called the Farewell Symphony. And so in addition to the composers being hired and staying at the palace and working with the prince and the royalty and having concerts and kind of being a servant, a little bit of the help for the royal family, so were the orchestra who was stationed there. They all lived there. They lived in the quarters in the palace. And so they would have their rehearsals at the palace, and they would have their concerts at the palace, and they would have a vacation at some point. They would have 2 or 3 months where they could all disperse, go back to their families, live with their families for that time, and then they would go back to work when the season would start again. And so by the time he was playing, he was premiering the 45th Symphony, the musicians were exhausted, and Haydn was exhausted, and they all just wanted to go home. They just wanted to go on vacation. And so what he did was, in the final movement, is that one by one, the musicians were told in their score to stand up and walk out. And so it was left with just 2 musicians on stage who silently walked out. This was a message to Prince Esterhazy to let us go on vacation, let us go. And he got the word, he got it loud and clear. But that's what Haydn is composing for. Now, he wasn't a prolific concerto composer. In fact, he didn't write very many compared to his symphonies that he did. But when he did, his piano concerto, this one in particular, was premiered in Paris. And so this is a little bit of what Paris would have looked like. At the time, it was in the late 1700s. In 1784, 1785 is when this was premiered. And it would have been premiered on either a harpsichord on the left or a pianoforte on the right. Now, the pianoforte was the new big thing. This was the instrument that Beethoven was operating from. The harpsichord is what Mozart was operating from, what Bach was operating from, and Haydn. And then the pianoforte, which is the predecessor to the standard grand piano that you're going to hear at the concert on next Friday, is going to be. But the pianoforte was small, and what you can see is that these were very elegant looking instruments. And it's because they focused and they were representative of class and society. The harpsichord was always very, very, very detailed, beautiful. And this one doesn't depict it as much, but oftentimes the lid up like that, you could have a complete mural essentially on it of a beautiful story from the Bible or story from Greek mythology, anything like that. And then inside of the actual soundboard, they had paintings of the life and death. And so that's, and starting at life close to the keys and going all the way to death the farthest way from the piano, you'd have this calligraphy engraved on the inside of the harpsichord. And so it showcased class, it showcased the aristocracy and this kind of high pinky up kind of attitude towards classical music that is, we don't really want today. Now we're trying to make it accessible to all, but that was where it's coming from. The pianoforte took that as well. These instruments were not only used legitimately to create the sounds and to be played on, but they were also seen as bits and pieces of furniture in the house. And so that's why they were laid in this one embroidered in gold, and you have face caps on the legs and everything like that. The pianoforte was about the same size as the harpsichord, which was a small, small instrument. If you see that table over there, the harpsichord may be a little bit longer and a tad bit wider than that. So much, much, much less large than the concert grand that you're going to see, which I think they have a 9-foot concert grand, so quite a bit bigger. And because these instruments were way, way, way smaller, the orchestras at the time were, of course, smaller too. And so, whereas if you go to a large orchestra downtown to Utah Symphony or to Timpanogos Symphony or something like that, you're going to see 60 people on stage, 60, 70 people, depending on the work that they're playing. For Haydn's music, much smaller, much more condensed orchestra, 4 or 5 string players per section, because these instruments would immediately just be drowned out. With the arrival of the grand piano, we can have much, much larger string sections and full complement of winds as well. And so these have a much, much more delicate sound. The harpsichord, as you can see, doesn't have any pedals. The pianoforte is when the pedals came into and sustained. So the harpsichord couldn't sustain. And you're going to hear a little bit of the history of this concerto being written for an instrument more like the harpsichord, because there's not these big massive sustained passages like we would hear in a Rachmaninoff piano concerto, where this muddy chord is playing and resonating in the concert hall. Instead, it's very, very clipped and charming and a little quirky, of course, laying into Haydn's quirky sense of humor that he kind of had. In 1784, a year after he wrote this piece, and a year before it was premiered, he met Mozart. And so their paths crossed in Austria, and it was Mozart's writing and his playing style that really kind of impacted Haydn to continue to writing for the piano, and to also kind of use some of Mozart's styles with his symphony into Haydn's symphony. And then we see Beethoven taking Haydn's ideas and thoughts and use of the symphony, and et cetera. So we have a direct correlation kind of from this lineage of German composers, of Austrian composers, well into the Romantic period. But the meeting of Mozart was pretty impactful for him. Mozart, of course, was this budding star at the time, and was just essentially kind of meeting someone like Lady Gaga. You know, that kind of, if we put it into popular context, that kind of process. So let's take a listen. And I want you to listen to the lightness in it. So how did composers at the time deal with the fact that the harpsichord couldn't sustain a pitch longer than you held? So you could hold a note down and it would slightly taper away. But what they did was they have that motor rhythm in there. So you're going to hear yun dun 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 dun. That's how they got to sustain the chord. Instead of just going boom. And then you'll notice that the pianist is actually conducting the orchestra as well. And this would be something that would be completely commonplace at this time. We wouldn't have a conductor, but rather either the concertmaster would be leading everybody, or the soloist, in this case the pianist harpsichordist that you would have, would be leading the orchestra. All right. So, who's playing this? His name is King Madsen. He's 8 years old, and he is absolutely adorable. And he's wonderful. And the whole time, and if you don't look at anything else, make sure that you can get on the side where you see his face, because he's just beaming when he's playing. And he puts that kind of personality, the fun, and this youthful just exuberance into it that I think Haydn would really have liked, rather than a stern, you know, kind of maybe more mature musician who's going to approach this work from a very mature angle. He's approaching it from a young boy's angle, which I think works perfectly for this style piece. He's 8 years old. You'll also see a contraption that's placed on the keys, the pedals of the piano, and it's because his legs simply are not long enough to hit the pedals, and so that's kind of an interesting thing too. You'll see this big box come out and be placed on the pedals, pedal extension, so that he can reach the pedals. But he's wonderful, and it's just an absolute treat to kind of to hear him performing this piece. It's perfect for him. It was perfect for him. And this brings us into the second. The next step is Juliana, which is the guitar concerto. And this is a rather, we don't often see a guitar played with an orchestra, especially soloing. In fact, there's only really one main guitar concerto, and that's the Concierto De Aranjuez, which is by Rodrigo, which, by the way, the symphony, Utah Symphony, is playing this weekend. If you want to hear guitar concerto played, it's a beautiful, absolutely glorious piece. But this piece is quite a bit different. It's his first concerto, and Giuliani was born in 1781 and lived until 1829, so vastly shorter life than Haydn, but around the same time. They did have a bit of an overlap, and in 1808 he wrote this piece. And so we're going to play the first movement, which is Allegro Maestoso. He's an Italian composer from, again, still the classical period, and before he really got into composition, he was a cellist, studied cello, and played a little bit of violin, and moved from those stringed instruments until he found his love, his passion, which was the guitar. And at the time, the guitar was seen as a very troubadour-like instrument. That's how it was used. It was used for folk songs and for dances. It wasn't used as much in a classical venue as the cello or as the violin that you would see. And so he toured all across Europe and played as a guitarist. And it wasn't until he was introduced a year before he wrote this piece to the classical style. And he goes, I want to write a guitar concerto that's like a violin concerto or like a cello concerto that we have. And so he wrote 150 compositions after this time in about 20 years for the guitar. He actually did a lot of arranging for the guitar. So a lot of what guitar players play, arrangements of very, very notable pieces like Rossini's Barber of Seville opera, he actually made a guitar arrangement for some of the more famous melodies and arias that were in Rossini's Barber of Seville. And so he was a big-time arranger, and he was big at employing and getting a lot of repertoire in the classical period for an instrument that really wasn't used as much in this time. So quite a boundary breaker at this time for the guitar. And it's because of his writing and his lead on writing this that we have composers like Rodrigo who were able to write guitar concertos as well. And so I mentioned a little bit about Rossini, who we have on the left. And at the same time, Giuliani was actually in cahoots a little bit with, and in the same circles as Beethoven was. And so he knew Beethoven, he had met Beethoven, and was studying the styles in the writing of Beethoven himself. And Beethoven was studying the styles in the writing of Haydn. And so we're starting to get all of these threads connected. So even if we don't have a really, really focused main theme on the concert, there is this web of these composers who are taking from each other and learning from each other and listening to each other and broadening their boundaries. Let's take a little bit of a listen to this guitar concerto. Just like Haydn, he used grand introductions. Small, intimate orchestra. You have the strings, couple of winds, no brass.
Will they have just a small group at the concert like this?
I think they're using, I don't think he's scaling down the strings at all. But the winds, of course, will be exactly what was written for. So far it sounds very Haydn, very Mozartian. So Giuliani was very, very, very influenced by opera at the time, of course. He's an Italian composer, and what's the Italians' trademark? It's their opera, and Rossini he was in love with. And so you got that huge, massive introduction in the very beginning by the orchestra. That was essentially the overture until we get to our first aria, if you will, by the soloist. And we have Matthew Baker, who's 12 years old, going to perform on the guitar. He is fantastic, and I heard him last week playing with it, and it's just going to be a really different experience, because like I said, you hear a lot of violin, you hear a lot of cello, you hear a lot of piano, you don't often hear guitar, and there's not much written for guitar with the orchestra, and so that's a little bit of a treat. You might notice his last name. His mother is Jenny Oakes Baker, who has performed with the orchestra quite a few times. She's a pretty well-known violinist, and so the musical gene is true in this case. It really wore off onto him as well. So it's just a really, really great, completely different audible experience that you have versus some of the other pieces on the program that we're going to listen to. And the way that Giuliani approaches a concerto is different. He makes it very operatic and very, very much so following that kind of style. And Haydn was coming at it and approaching at it from a very Germanic symphonic angle. And so this is just a good way to look at the concerto and how it's starting to evolve. It's starting to gain prominence, especially in Europe at the time. Which brings us to this gentleman, Edouard Lalo, who was born in 1823 and died in 1892. So he's at the brunt of the Romantic period through the 1800s. And he wrote this piece in 1874. We're going to be playing the first movement, which is the Allegro Non Troppo. He is a French composer during the Romantic time. So we're going to travel a little bit to France. And he is most known for his colorful orchestration and the rich and lush textures that he's using, which are often heard in German music. And so what you're going to hear is something that you would almost attribute a lot to somebody like Brahms. He has a very Brahmsian thick texture and style. Just like Haydn, he was also a conductor as well. And this gentleman who he met, this is Berlioz. And so the Symphony Espagnole he's a French composer, but it has this Latin flair to it, this Spanish flair to it. And this was happening with all of the French composers at the time, and it was no difference with Berlioz and other composers like Bizet and stuff. We had this new idea of the Spanish Vogue style coming out in the mid-19th century. And this was this obsession with artists, not just musicians, but artists in general, having exploring this Latin roots and Latin terrain and styles of dance, of culture. And they're playing it and they're placing it into their music. We saw this a lot with Debussy and Ravel as well. And so this began around the 1870s, 1860s, 1870s, and went for about 50 years, where a lot of the French compositions and the French styles were heavily influenced by Spanish culture and coming straight out of Spain. And so this was also premiered in Paris about 100 years after Haydn's Piano Concerto was premiered in Paris. And coincidentally, all three of these pieces so far were premiered to great success. And sometimes we hear these pieces that we like now that are not premiered to with so much of a following, but all three so far were really big and sensational at the time, which is pretty important. So this is what Paris looked like about the time. I had to get Notre Dame in there just because of recent events, but just to show that it is a very, very, very important piece of architecture in our history. So Bizet was also infatuated with this Spanish Vogue sense. And so a year after Lalo composed the Symphony Espagnole, we get Carmen coming out, which sweeps the operatic world as well. And Bizet is known to say that he really got a lot of the influence from Lalo's writing of this particular concerto, which again at the time wasn't necessarily a concerto, but was more supposed to be a larger symphonic work. But because of the feature of the violin, it now is kind of known as a standard concerto piece. So Carmen's coming out at the same time, a year later after that. And Tchaikovsky, a Russian composer. What does Tchaikovsky have to do with this? Well, Tchaikovsky was very, very, very particular in the composers that he chose to like and the pieces that he liked to perform or to have his students performing. And so when he heard this concerto and this piece, he actually would play the piano for his violin students, and he absolutely loved it. He loved it. He loved playing it, and he loved hearing it. And so it was this piece that caused Tchaikovsky to drop his piano concerto that he was working on and start writing his first violin concerto. So if we didn't have this piece that you're going to hear, we wouldn't have Tchaikovsky's violin concerto, which is probably, and I shudder to say this, but I think I can say it, one of the most famous violin concertos in the repertoire of the time is Tchaikovsky's. And without this concerto, we wouldn't have this piece that was coming. So let's take a quick little listen to it. Listen to the lush textures. Quite a bit different than the classical pieces that we had heard. Almost no introduction. Get right into it. And so one of the great things about this type of concert is that you'll see the evolution of the concerto and you'll hear the different styles. We oftentimes hear, classical period, and we think dates. And we see, 20th century, we think dates. And we just know, okay, that's why. But really, what's more important than the actual date of each of these genres is it's really the evolution of what music is starting to do. And so we have a huge orchestra now. The instrument itself that are soloing in the front can do much, much more. So with the evolution of the music is really propelled by the evolution of the architecture of the instrument itself and the makers, the instrument makers using different woods, stronger woods, tighter strings, going from catgut to eventually to what we have the strings made of now. And then the piano is growing and becoming different instruments. instruments. They have different limitations and different boundaries. And so the concertos can sound a lot different than they did. And you get to hear that, and you get to, and rather than looking at it as a classical piece, you can hear it and go, it is classical because it's written in this type of way. This piece is romantic because it's written in this kind of way. I don't want to give it all away. It's hard to stop. We have an 11-year-old playing that, what she was playing. It's fantastically technical. Her name is Evelyn Mavis, and she is the daughter of one of the violinists in the orchestra, Georg, who has been playing with the orchestra for forever. But he's a violin maker, isn't he? Yeah, yeah, and so it just makes sense then that his daughter is also playing the violin on this piece. But it's a brilliant piece, and so that's a little look into it. You're going to get a little bit of Spanish Vogue into this. So we have a German piano, we have an Italian guitar, and a Spanish violin that we have so far. So quite a cultural concert. Let's move into MacDowell. And this is our first taste of an American influence on the concert. And he wrote a second piano concerto in 1885. He was born in 1860, so he's 25 years old when he wrote this. And he died in 1908. Again, kind of another short life that we have here. The first movement we're going to perform is the Larghetto Calmato. He's an American composer who's primarily in the Romantic period. And this is his best known work. Unfortunately, most of his pieces are rarely performed, with the exception of this piano concerto, which is quite studied, which is often studied. But he had an amazing impact on American music that is oftentimes overlooked. And he was born in New York. He has over 60 compositions, all different styles of compositions, concertos and symphonies, etc. But he started something called the MacDowell Colony, which was basically this club. He was an academic as well as a composer and a performer, but he started this colony, and it was basically to usher more classical music coming from America, from American composers, especially in the late 1800s into the turn of the century. And it is because of him and because of his influence, and of course this colony was funded, and it had grants and funding and scholarships that went out to different students. And students who partook in this were Aaron Copland and Walter Piston and Samuel Barber, Elliott Carter, the great Leonard Bernstein, among many, 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 many more. Amy Beach was one of them, who is one of America's first pioneering female composers that we get. And so it was because of his tutelage and setting up this and this continuing kind of grant system of fundraising to fundraise composers. Remember, we talked a little bit about how Haydn was a composer and looking at that career when it wasn't very, very smart to go into composition. At the turn of the century, it still wasn't smart to go into composition. And he wanted to really propel that and get more and more composers, especially within America, because all the music that was coming over was transplanted from Europe. And so we wanted to get the influence in America. And so he did quite a bit of that. He was on faculty at Columbia University for a little bit, but he just really wasn't cut out for the bureaucracy of academia. And so he left after a while because his anxieties got too intense. And because of his anxieties, he had insomnia that came from this, and he had a lot of effects of depression that came from this. And so one of the ways to treat insomnia and depression was with potassium bromide, and this eventually led to his death because it was this that basically poisoned him and ended his life quite a bit earlier. And he was American born in New York, but he traveled to Europe, especially to, I believe it was he went to Germany, but I can't remember where he studied, but he studied for a little bit. And he played a recital, and he had the most impactful recital was because these two characters showed up and listened to him play and had comments afterwards. One on the left is Clara Schumann, the wife of, at this time, the late Robert Schumann, massive composer. Clara was a composer herself, as well as a virtuosic pianist. And so McDowell was playing a piano recital, and so she was there. On the right, he was also there, Franz Liszt. And these two have a very tumultuous relationship, so it's kind of interesting that they were at the same, some of the same events. Clara Schumann was a big proponent of absolute music with her husband as well as Brahms. And this was composers who were championing music that was written for the sake of music. Liszt, on the other hand, was a programmatic composer, which means that he was premiering music and composing music that had a storyline or that had imagery to it. So if you think of Dante's, he has Les Préludes, all of these pieces and his large works, these tone poems that he starts to create, have imagery in them. And so they fought about that for decades and decades and decades. But they both really enjoyed McDowell's playing, and this gave him kind of the confidence when he returned back to America to play with Boston Symphony and to then go on to teach in Columbia, which we know didn't last quite long. Here's a little taste of McDowell's Second Piano Concerto. Let me start from the beginning. We'll just start there. Where Haydn's piece could be played on the harpsichord or the forte piano or the grand piano, this piece could not be played on the harpsichord or the forte piano. He's highly influenced by Chopin, and you can see that in this spot right here. So just this very large and kind of dramatic diva almost quality to it, with very early insights into American music that we start to hear. And so Jill Smith will be performing this. She's 14 years old, and it'll just be, again, like all of the 6 performers that you'll see, just pretty mind-boggling to think of these such young students, most of which I don't think any of them, maybe the oldest being 16 has her driver's license, but they don't even have driver's license yet, and they're playing these pieces, which is infuriating and inspiring at the same time. All right, let's go to somebody that you probably all know. His name's Rachmaninoff. He was born in 1873 and lived until 1943. And his second piano concerto was premiered and written in 1900. This piano concerto is a pivot in Rachmaninoff's life. And we're going to be playing the third movement, which is Allegro Scherzando. He's a Russian composer from the Romantic period. This is his most popular piano concerto, and he has 4, but it's established established his career. And it really established his career because of the problem that he had with his first symphony. Right prior to this concerto, he wrote his first symphony, and it came out to really awful reviews. It was not received well, and this being his first work or his first symphony was devastating to him, and he also hated it when he heard it played. And so, so this piece itself is pretty important in his life as a pivot and kind of brought him back. But he won a Glinka Award. Mikhail Glinka is a Russian composer as well, traditionalist and Russian composer, and one of the main cultural kind of composers for Russia. It's kind of how we view Aaron Copland or Leonard Bernstein as these staunch American composers. Glinka was that equivalent in Russia. And so they had awards, and they would present this to different composers for certain pieces, almost like a Pulitzer. And so what we have here is the first of what he would eventually, he would take home 5, but this was the first Glinka Award that he received, which again gave him prominence in Russia as a Russian composer. This piece brought him out of a deep depression that he was having, and that resulted from the massive negative reception of his first symphony. In fact, he went to the rehearsals of the symphony and was just so appalled at what he was hearing, the way that the musicians were approaching his work, the way that the conductor, who at the time was Glazunov, and Glazunov is a Russian composer, very high-ranking Russian composer at the time. No one took it seriously, his first symphony, and they just thought it was just this kind of pathetic attempt at writing. And so it threw him into a deep depression, and he didn't compose or write any music for years before he kind of started to whittle out this second piano concerto. And he was also a conductor, just like 2 of the other previous ones before him. This piano concerto, this is the 5th work that we're talking about, and just like all the 4 previous that came before it, they were all well received, and so was this one. So I think our artists are onto something here. They're choosing works that are very well received, and we're still receiving them well today. And so his first symphony was so poorly received that one of the reviewers and main music critics in Russia at the time wrote in a journal that it was equivalent to the 10 plagues of Egypt. And so if that doesn't throw you into a depression, I don't know what would. And I just thought that that was a very interesting little bit of information. And he said about his very own symphony, "I'm not at all affected by its lack of success or critical reaction, but felt deeply distressed and heavily depressed by the fact that my symphony did not please me at all when he heard it." So his own work, even though it wasn't well received by the public, wasn't even well received by him. So he went back to the drawing boards, and in 1918 he found himself in New York. And so this is, about almost 20 years after the piano concerto premiered. And he fled Russia because of the Russian Revolution that was happening at the time. If you remember back about a month or so ago when we did the Russian composers, Rachmaninoff was on it. The other big composer was Shostakovich, and Shostakovich stayed in Russia at the time and had to deal with all of the tribulations and the pain that was happening with the artists in Russia. Rachmaninoff said, and he fled. And he lived there for the next 20 years of his life, essentially. This piece was dedicated to this person. This is Nikolai Dahl. And Nikolai Dahl was a physician as well as an amateur musician, music lover. And so he was in kind of similar circles as Rachmaninoff in Russia at the time, at the turn of the century. And so when Rachmaninoff was going through all of these mental issues with dealing with his own piece and other problems that he was having with this depression, he was seeing this therapist at the time. And he attributed his getting out of this depression and his whole kind of reimagining of his composition style and his work to this man. And so he dedicated it to this. So let's listen to a little bit of Rachmaninoff's piano concerto. quite a bit different than Haydn's Piano Concerto. And different than McDowell's Piano Concerto. Some of the hardest literature ever written for piano is by Rachmaninoff, and then Liszt as well, but Rachmaninoff from the Russian angle. And we have a 13-year-old playing that. Her name is Dora Maivis, which you might recognize that name because that's the sister of Evelyn who's playing. So they both won, and it was just, it's pretty jaw-dropping to watch these sisters in action. And I can only hope that they start to pair up and do some playing together, and I'll release some CDs, and they're really, like I said, it's just going to be awe-striking to see all 6 of these young artists. And then finally, last but not least, we have Bartok's violin, second violin concerto. Bartok lived from 1881 until 1945. And so he lived 2 years after Rachmaninoff. And found himself in the same area as Rachmaninoff was. And so he wrote this piece in 1937 to 1938. We're going to play the first movement, Allegro Non Troppo, at the concert. He is a Hungarian composer from the 20th century period. And so this is our only exploration into 20th century music on this concert. The rest are classical and romantic. And so differences that you'll hear are the styles of the orchestra and the chords that he's using and the way that he's using the concerto, and especially the violin in the concerto itself. But Bartok was really well known for making great leaps in the research of musicology and ethnomusicology. In fact, when he was alive, he was more known for his research of folk melodies and tunes from Hungary than he was for his own compositions, which was a constant frustration for him and led to a lot of anguish. But he was, this piece was initially meant to be a set of variations, but the person who was premiering it said, no, I want 3 movements. I don't want one full movement of different variations, maybe like that of Rachmaninoff's variations that we heard on the last concert, which is one gigantic, large piece, multiple different variations of the main melody. He wanted, the person who he was writing this for wanted 3 movements. Bartok fled to the US during World War II because he was an outright and outspoken anti-fascist. And so he was very much so against the Nazi Party. And because of that, it made big threats on him. We have to remember that at the time of when the Nazi Party was in charge, they used musicians, they used composers as propaganda. And so you were either in or you were out. And if you were out, anyone who liked your music, anyone who listened or performed your music was also out. And you were put on banished lists. And if you were in, you were used as this machine by the Nazis and by the Reich. And that's a whole different another hour of research that we could go into, but let's not. But here we go. We have another link to Columbia University. Now, McDowell worked at Columbia University, wasn't for him. And Columbia granted and gave scholarship and money to Bartok to research this. And unfortunately, after moving to America, he was only here for a little bit before he died of leukemia, a little bit after. What is really important about this piece that you're going to hear and shows the 20th century is the idea of 12-tone music. Do you know what 12-tone music is? So 12-tone music was this a very beginning of avant-garde, which we got with classical music in the 50s and 60s. And 12-tone was where composers would use all 12 chromatic notes of the scale and put them, arrange them in some sort of pattern to create a melody. And so what we have is this. and a tremolo. So that is, every single note is completely different. He uses all 12 pitches in the chromatic scale to build that melody, and then you're going to hear that elaborated on. And so composers got really crazy with 12-tone series in the next, and so this was written 37, 38, 20 years in the making. Composers are primarily only composing in 12-tone series, and they're really stretching the boundaries of this. But Bartok was one of the first composers who really thought about this and put it into his work. So let's take a listen to his second violin concerto, which is using this 12-tone technique. Bartok's composition style was heavily influenced on his research of folk music and in musicology. And so he listened to and penned down thousands and thousands of folk melodies that he had heard when he was traveling all over the place. And he used them in a lot of his music. And so that's how you get this kind of folky, worldly, some peasant dances will crop up in the middle of this beautiful piece. You know, it's very interesting. And so we have a 16-year-old, our oldest, Rachel Call, will be performing the Bartok Violin Concerto. And I heard her a couple of years ago play the Sibelius Violin Concerto. She is just an absolute star. She's performed with almost every single orchestra in the state, and so she's definitely going to go somewhere. I know it. So keep an eye out for that name, and maybe just like some of Utah's famous musicians who come back and perform, who grew up here. I think she's going to be added onto that list very soon. But that is the 6 pieces that we'll be exploring. And so hopefully everybody, you have a little bit of a lead on everybody else who's going to be at the concert, because they're not going to hear all the difference of the style of just that one word, tomato, tomato, concerto, concerto. What are the different uses of the concerto that we get? So we hope you enjoy the concert on Friday, next Friday, not this Friday, but next Friday. And especially these young artists, all the work they've put into it, into preparing these pieces and to beating out their competition, which was all very, very, very difficult, and then putting on a fantastic program for everybody to enjoy. So we hope to see you there, and tell your friends about it. Tell your friends, tell your family, bring everybody, because it's going to be a really great night. So there you go.